Half-timbered buildings are some of my favorite models to build. They look good, they come in all sorts of bizarre configurations, and best of all for a crafter, they're made of lots of sections, so it's really easy to hide join lines. They also have tons of different textures, which makes them great to paint. For a wargamer, they can also provide interesting situations, as their geometry, jutting, and changes of level can block or create lines of sight in ways a regularly shaped building cannot. In this video, I will be going over how I built this model half-timber house, but I will try to keep it generic so you can apply this to any half-timber model you want to make. Although I will be using a hot wire for speed, all the cuts should be doable with a sharp knife and a lot of care. I started off the foundation by moving the head on the hot wire cutter a little and beveling the edge of the piece of foam so that the bottom of the wall would flare out. Then I reset the head to its vertical position, took a thicker piece and trimmed it to size so that it would fit neatly on top of the base. I wanted stairs leading up to the doorway, so I marked out how wide I wanted the doorway to be and cut out the rest to make room for the stairs. At this stage I had not yet glued the parts together, as the glue can mess up a cut. A light pressure is enough to keep them together, they don't slip easily. While readjusting the fence, I am releasing the pedal so the wire doesn't burn the foam. If you're doing this without a pedal, remember to switch off the cutter at these points. On the lower part, I left an extra piece of wall because I had an idea, but I later changed my mind as I didn't like the look of it. At this point though, I glued the two pieces together and used some pins to hold everything in place. Next, I took a block with the same width as the doorway piece and sliced it into sheets of regular thickness. I had already calculated how many steps I needed to cut to reach the height I needed, but since every build is going to be different, it makes no sense to give you numbers. Just divide the height of the piece by the height of each step. Then I started to slice up the steps in 1.5 cm increments. The top step is 1.5 cm deep, the next one is 3 cm, next one is 4.5 and so on. I glued them together and that's the stair. Once the glue set, I glued them into the foundation and trimmed off that extra bit. For texture, I drew in the bricks with a pen. I tried to keep regular lines and gave the base larger bricks. Around the stairs, I drew in some refer stones. You would normally see this in places where the perimeter of an old wall was modified without being rebuilt completely. To give the pieces even more texture, I went over every brick and drew in either a hatched pattern or just scribbled on it to make it look like worn brick. The reason I used an HB pencil with a round point here is that it's a lot less likely to tear the foam than a pen. I wanted to finish the foundation off before I moved on to the building proper, so I mixed up some sealer to protect it so I could spray it. I can't give you exact proportions here because different brands of paint, PVA, dish soap and even different hardnesses of water will give you different results. What you need to look for is a thin consistency that will flow easily off the mixing stick. If you're using Mod Podge instead of PVA, you might want it even runnier, as that won't shrink as much as the PVA, which means it can obscure some details. Slap it on, spread it around so there isn't any pooling, and make sure you've covered everything. Don't worry if it doesn't dry a solid color. As long as there's at least a little tint on it, it should be safe for spraying. What I did next was to spray it grey and white. At this point I dabbed it with heavily tinned yellow and brown paints. Left that to dry and then slapped on some Payne's Grey. I got this recipe of Geek Gaming Scenics, though I had to go back to watch my Dwarven Monument video to remember how I had mixed it previously. This takes a while to dry, so I put it aside and got started on the building. Fun fact, I used to think that half-timber was called that way because many of them have a stone ground floor and the rest is timber, but that's not the case. The name comes from the fact that in Europe at least, the posts were made by cutting a log in half, hence half-timber. Now, the building itself is just made of blocks of foam you can put together any which way. It's the texture which is really important here. I marked out the posts and beams with a shallow cut with a knife before texturing them with a pencil. It's easier to start on the panels first as they're recessed. Just use the side of the pencil in a circular motion and press the panel down. The knife cuts will let the foam part easily, so you get a nice clean separation between the parts and the wood. Don't try to be too neat. The panels would usually be made of boards, bricks, or even wattle and daub, but the outside would be covered in plaster or something similar. The pencil should give you a good texture to approximate that. To texture the wood, I use the tip of my pencil to draw grain lines. You could also use wire brush, but I prefer the stylized result the pencil gives. I wanted a glass window in at least one place, so I took a thin strip of foam and drew on a diamond pattern with a pen. Then I added a little bubble in the center of each diamond. To build the frame, I added in tiny, thin strips of foam. In hindsight, using matchsticks would have been a lot easier here. For the door, I textured the piece with a plank pattern, then glued on a separate piece I had cut a doorway into. Because the doorway is 5mm thick, the same as the other posts, the join will hide easily in the pattern. Then I just glued in a few more bits for bands and a lock. For the roof, I cut out some triangular pieces and glued them on the top of the building. This is my first time making and using foam shingles, so take this with a pinch of salt. I started off with a block of foam and gave it a rough wood texture before slicing off a thin sheet. I repeated this a few times till I had a stack of textured sheets. I cut these into 5mm strips, then cut the strips into 1.5cm shingles. Gotta be honest with you, shingles are not a thing where I live, so I have no clue if these proportions make any sense. But here I am with a tub of foam shingles. I just glued these up to the roof with PVA glue, trying to offset each row a little with various degrees of success. To top off the roofs, I used some longer pieces glued across the ridges. Since these shingles are really thin, they bend very easily without breaking. Okay, I'll save you another ceiling montage and jump directly to painting. This time I sprayed the bulk of the building cadmium yellow, since that is my base color for wood and filling in the posts neatly is a lot more time consuming than filling the panels. I did respray the roofs white, since blue works out better on that. Since I'm going to use washes, I also sprayed on a light coat of gloss varnish to protect these coats. My strategy for painting wood is fairly simple, just go over it with a dark brown wash. If it still looks too anemic after that, give it another brown wash. We'll go over it with a dry brush too, but that's for later. The panels got filled in with a medium grey. Looking back, I think I should have used a lighter grey here. I think I tend to go for dark colours in general. This part of the painting is fairly easy, just turn the piece so you're always working from a comfortable angle. I have to point out that though I assembled the piece before painting, in retrospect it would have been a lot easier to paint it in sections and then put it together later, as some pieces were very difficult to reach. Next we're going to get a light grey and dry brush over everything we've painted so far. Wood, plaster, everything. This adds some depth to the plaster and gives the wood a nice weathered look. To make the panels pop a bit more, I grabbed one of my Kolinsky kitchen sponges and started to dab on some ivory. You don't want a lot of paint on the sponge, it's a lot like dry brushing, except you're dabbing rather than brushing. The sponge leaves a cool texture, and in these buildings, texture is not the answer, is the question. The answer is yes. The roof got a straightforward coat of blue, and the dry brush in a lighter blue. To paint the glass window, I started by base coating in black and painting all the raised areas blue, trying to avoid all the recesses. Then I applied a few highlights here and there using a slightly lighter blue. Once that was dry, I sprayed in a little varnish to protect these layers and laid the building on its side, to paint in some very thin PVA. I did this in 2 layers, and though that takes a while to dry, I'm pretty happy with the effect. You could also use gloss varnish, gloss Mod Podge or gloss medium for this. To finish off, I added in a door pull, buffed it a little with a pencil and moved on to take some pretty pictures. I really enjoy making half-timbered buildings. I appreciate the aesthetic, and looking at real-world examples for reference is tons of fun, as there are some examples of really weird architecture that would fit right into most fantasy worlds. There's also a lot of variety to pick from between different periods and places, so there's tons of inspiration to be had. In fact, I might just go dig up some more. Bye!